Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Emma Hayes, and I'm here with my lovely colleague, Rowena Chong, who is standing by in the chat room. And together we usually run walks in beautiful bushland of Willoughby, and we're normally educating the community and school groups about the natural world. However, today we are very much looking forward to learning more about what circular fashion means and the different ways we can work towards the reduction of textile waste. I'm someone that really loves fashion. I love flicking through fashion mags, and I really appreciate beautiful fabrics and design. And unfortunately, like you, I'm also someone who has been horrified by stories and images of the pollution caused by textile production and waste. I try to buy less, I buy secondhand, mend, make rags, and, I'm clearly wearing a pretty 90s outfit and upcycled earrings. However, as a mum, I find our family does create textile waste. I'd like to do more to close the loop and talk to our community about what we can do together to reduce textile waste. Willoughby Council is on this journey. We're offering Recycle Smart power pickups that allows you to leave textiles and other hard to recycle products on your doorstep for collection. We also support the Repair Cafe in Lane Cove, where you can have repairs made to clothing or other items. And since delving into this world of textiles, I'm learning something new every day, and I feel really positive about the possible changes that could be made in the circular economy in general. So we are really pleased to now pass you over to Dr. Clara Vulatech from the Future Fashion Agency. Clara has a PhD in sustainable textiles and is an advisor within the fashion industry. This is a huge topic. There's a lot for Clara to cover, but she's going to take breaks in her presentation, and we really hope that you guys join the conversation too. So thank you, and please take it away, Clara.
Thanks, Emma. Thank you. I'm just gonna do my sharing screen. There we go. So, thank you and welcome everybody. I'm so happy to be here. As Emma said, I have been doing quite a lot of work myself over the last few years back in Australia with a lot of the fashion industry, fashion brands and retailers. But I'm so excited that a lot of the other kind of textile stakeholders, as we say, are becoming very interested. So we're getting a lot of interest from local councils, hence why Emma reached out to me and sort of what can Willoughby Council as an area in Sydney and a council do around your clothing and textile waste issues. So I'm really happy to be here and happy to share some of the knowledge and experience that I've had in this space. So it's, as Emma said, it's over an hour. We're going to have a little bit of room for some questions and discussion around some of the kind of key topics that we've covered. So firstly, I'm just going to give you a kind of general introduction and set the context for what the kind of problem is. Then we're going to vision ourselves into the future. There's a huge boom in the global fashion industry is exploring what circular fashion is. And so we're going to kind of put on our visionary hats and imagine what a better future for the fashion industry and for closing the loop on fashion clothes might look like. And then we're going to talk a little bit about what we can all do as consumers of clothing, essentially. So hopefully you'll get some useful tidbits. So a little bit about me. As Emma said, I trained as a printer textile designer. I'm an Aussie by background. I ended up living in London for over 10 years, where I did a printed textile design training at Chelsea College of Art. And then I got very passionate myself as a designer in what are the impacts of the fashion and textile industry, and what can I do as a designer to change that? So I ended up doing a PhD where I went into a lot of UK and Swedish-based fashion brands and ran a whole lot of training for designers and the people who actually design and develop fashion garments. So what can they do better to improve those products? And then I've been back in Australia for the last 6 years now, where, as I said, I've been mainly consulting to fashion brands and retailers, but increasingly, you know, as I said, state government, local council, even the federal government are now starting to really understand that there's an issue, you know, primarily around clothing and textile waste, but we know that the life cycle of any fashion product, from the raw materials all the way through to when we dispose of those garments, all of there's environmental impacts across that whole life cycle. And I just thought I'd put this in. I mean, I did do a PhD, and as I said, I did have a textile craft practice. So I was a quilter. I produced hand-printed textiles. So one of the outcomes of my PhD was actually a hand-quilted jacket, which that's it in the picture, and this is it here. I spent 3 weeks hand stitching this. I sat in my studio in London, and it's all hand stitched. It's got the Chinese word for sustainability handwritten on the lining. And it was really made in response to my journey through this whole topic, which took me from London to Sweden to China to visiting garment factories and back again. So, you know, charity shops and secondhand clothes have always been a really big part of my own creative practice. And, you know, I've always, as Emma has said as well, I've always shopped secondhand. So I'm really passionate about us, you know, preserving and finding new ways to use our clothes. So where are we now? So what is the current state of the fashion textile industry? So, you know, obviously there's a global picture, but just to kind of keep it contextualized to here in Australia, we know that Australians spend $5 billion on fashion clothing or fashion items every year. It's quite a huge industry. It employs almost 500,000 people. That's just in Australia. We also know Australians are huge consumers of fashion. So we approximately consume 27 kilos in weight of clothing every year, which is only the second highest consumers just after the Americans, which is quite staggering. And we also know we discard 23 kilos. So if we're buying 27 kilos of clothing every year, each one of us, and throwing 23 of those kilos in landfill, can you see that there is a huge issue here? So again, we're getting some better data here, but we know around 700,000 tons of clothing and textiles, so this includes household linens and soft furnishings and carpet, is going into landfill every year. So we know that even just for Sydney councils to send clothing and textiles to landfill through their curbside collections, their bulky goods collections, that's costing Sydney councils $14 million a year just to dump clothing and textiles in landfill. And we also know clothing and textiles sitting in landfill, it's not decomposing, it's not going into a beautiful compostable soil, it's literally sitting there with all the other household rubbish, and it's also emitting methane and carbon. So we know we've got an issue. And then just, you know, zooming out a little bit to the global context, as I said, the fashion industry is going through huge change. You're probably aware of this. If most of us, we all might not consider ourselves consumers of or into fashion, but we all have to wear clothes, we all have to buy clothing. There's been a huge shift going on globally with the fashion industry, and this is being driven by a whole heap of different things. We have had some really disastrous things going on in production countries like Bangladesh. There was the Rana Plaza disaster that happened about 10 years ago now that really kind of raised a lot of awareness around the issues with social impact and workers' rights. We have huge, complex global supply chains. Most of our textiles are produced in China and in India. The toxic impacts to their waterways and their ecosystems is staggering. I mean, admittedly, China has previously been terrible in this regard, but they are cleaning up their act. but just to say, you know, in China, there is all this anecdotal evidence of just coming across rivers that are completely a color, like there's the Red River, or here is all this kind of terrible purple pollution. And then, of course, it's out of mind, out of sight for us here in Australia, because we are not involved in the global production of textiles. And as I said, well, you know, we know that the rise of fast fashion has caused this huge exponential growth in the amount of clothes that fashion brands are churning out, and then the amount that's available to us as consumers at very low prices. And then this is just what's perpetuating this huge amounts of clothing and textile waste. Now, obviously, here in Australia, as I said, it's all starting to really become, which I'm very excited about, become a, you know, a topic of interest and concern. We had, for example, a few years ago, that fantastic show that some of you might have seen on the ABC, War on Waste, where the journalist, I can't remember his name, Craig, he looked at textiles, and there was a really shocking image that he created a whole pile of old clothes in Martin Place. And, you know, just to kind of demonstrate, and it was a very powerful image for people. I think that really helped us to understand the issue. You've had China in the last few years has actually banned a lot of our recycled materials that Australia has been shipping to China. Textiles have been included. They've banned that now. So that's also made, you know, Australia as a country sort of think about some alternatives. And again, the federal government has set some new, an action plan and some strategy, and they're finally including clothing and textiles. And again, the waste management sector as well, everyone, and as I say, local council. So everyone is now getting on board with the fact that this is a growing concern. So, you know, obviously, as I said, we all wear clothes. We might not all consider ourselves fashion consumers, but we do all wear clothes. And again, some of you might know a little bit about where clothes come from, but for a lot of people, the apparel sector, the fashion industry, it's very, you know, it's not very transparent, and a lot of us have no idea. So I just wanted to kind of quickly go over essentially, where do your clothes come from? You know, we talk about, this is called, in industry, they call this their value chain, or it's essentially a supply chain. And we know that to make a textile fashion product is hugely complex. Obviously, as a designer, I like to say it all starts with the designer. So the designer conceives in their minds of a new garment. It might be a dress, a top, a t-shirt, whatever it is. It is an idea that's formed in the designer's mind, and then their job is to turn that into a physical product. So it's made from a material, a textile, and those textiles can be either a synthetic or a natural fiber. So the most well-known natural fiber we know is cotton, made from a plant, farmed. And I'm going to go into the kind of different fiber types in a minute, but we know that cotton makes up about, well, probably about 15 to 20% of all of the clothing that we consume in Australia. The other type of fiber that's the majority is the synthetics, and polyester is the winner. It's almost 50% of the garments that we buy in Australia have some sort of polyester or synthetic included in them. So once the raw materials are either picked or spun, then those are made into a textile, either a knit or a woven, and then that fabric is then shipped to a garment factory. Most of this is going on primarily in China, India, or Cambodia or Vietnam, those Asian countries. So then the textiles are made up into a garment, and then obviously they are shipped to either a retail store, or we buy them as consumers online. So that's essentially a kind of very simple way of saying it's a very, very highly complex process. And along that whole chain, there are environmental and social impacts. I'm not going to go into the details, but it's pretty huge. So I wondered who of you know the clothing that you're wearing now, I just wonder if you know what it's made from. So the tops that you're all wearing, who put a little hand up in the chat if you know what your top is made from, or whatever you're wearing is made from. Oop. Yep, a few of you. Oh, good. Okay, there's only 2 hands, 3 hands. Okay, so that's interesting. So the majority of people, and that is typical, aren't that familiar with what their clothes are actually made from. So I thought I would just go through the main fiber types and really just drill down a little bit into what are the pros and cons in terms of sustainability of these fibers, and what are some better fibers? What can we do? How can we kind of think about purchasing better fibers? And again, obviously, this is very complex for us as just the general fashion consumer. A lot of the industry are making these decisions, and then there's not a lot of transparency for us as consumers. So it can be tricky, and I understand that. But I think the more you kind of self-educate, the better. So as I said, there's primarily 3 categories of fibers. There's the naturals, made from natural materials. There's the synthetics that are manufactured from non-natural materials, like the polyesters. And then there's a 3rd group that I'm actually calling the regenerated cellulose. So these are like a bamboo viscose or a lyocell. So I'll explain how they're different. But starting with cotton. So we know cotton is obviously a natural. It comes from a plant, which is an agricultural product. Depending on what region it comes from. In Australia, we do a lot of cotton farming, but if it comes from India, it's primarily, going to be farmed by farmers who have small holdings. It's not going to be mass industry. If it comes from America have huge mass scale cotton farming. So there's different kind of regions around the world have different kind of scales of cotton farming. And then that will determine as well the impacts. But essentially we know that you can kind of say generally cotton uses huge amounts of pesticides and water in the growing stage. We also know when they're actually processing the fiber and they're finishing it, so it's been made into a fabric, either a knit or a woven, the finishing that goes on the top, either to protect it or to dye it, those have very heavy chemicals. We also know that there are some issues with the labour. There can be risk of child labour in some parts of the world that grow cotton. And we also know that cotton is very tricky to recycle down at the end of life into a new fibre. You can respin it, but it's a very poor quality fibre. And so what are the better alternatives? There are several that are on the market. There's what's called BCI, Better Cotton Initiative, that a lot of brands are now purchasing. And there's also organic cotton, which we know is more expensive, but the price is actually coming down. And there's a lot more organic cotton that you're seeing on the market at kind of, even the Kmarts and the Targets of the world, I've noticed in the last few years. Okay, so that's an example of a natural fibre. So the next large group of fibre is the synthetics, and the most well-known is the polyester. So this is made from essentially petroleum. So it is made from crude oil, and it is a non-renewable. Obviously, polyester was invented as a new fibre to replace cotton. Cotton has a lot of issues around care and creasing. So, the fashion industry wanted to give consumers a better option that was more practical. Polyester was one of those new fibres that were invented. So it's got some positive points in terms of its use, but a lot of negatives in terms of environmental impact. It uses antimony, which is a really terrible carcinogenic substance at the production stage. We know it sheds microfibers, and we know it's non-biodegradable. So if there's polyester clothing sitting in a landfill, it's sitting there for 200 to 300 years. It's not going anywhere. But we do know that there is a recycled polyester that is increasingly on the market. It doesn't come from old polyester clothes, though. That's the myth. It actually comes from plastic bottles. And as I said, we've now got some good data on Australian clothing imports. We know that 50% of all the clothing that was imported into Australia in the last few years is made from synthetics, which I would say is primarily polyester. There could be some nylons in there, but I'd say it's mostly polyester. And then, as I said, there's a third group of fibers, and this is the regenerated cellulose. So as I was saying, you know, polyester was invented because cotton obviously had its limitations in terms of wear and use. These regenerated cellulose are are relatively new when you look back over the kind of 20th century of fiber production. And they're unusual because they are made from a natural raw material. So they're made from wood pulp, which is from basically trees that they shred and then turn into a pulp, and then that's spun into through a viscose process. So they're slightly unusual. They are made from a raw material that is natural, but they can be made in a very highly industrial and toxic environment. You know you're onto a good thing if the lyocell that you buy is from a company like Tencel, because they've got a very closed loop production system, and they only use wood that's from sustainably managed wood or forests, mainly in Europe. So again, you've got to kind of watch, you know, the detail around it. But we know that that's an emerging fiber type that's being touted as a more sustainable option to the polyester. And then just, I guess, the fourth group is what we call blends, which is a category on its own. Again, these blends were invented to make it easier for us as wearers of clothing and textiles. You know, we know lots of school uniforms and a lot of bedding is made from polycotton blends, 50% polyester, 50% cotton. A lot of underwear, or most underwear, is mainly cotton, and then it's got a little bit of elastane for the stretch in it. These blends, again, have pros and cons. From an end-of-life kind of recycling perspective, they can be very challenging to recycle. There is a solution that's coming from a really pioneering Australian startup, which I will tell you a little bit about further down the presentation. So those are the main fiber types. And now I just want to talk a little bit about, now we understand as well kind of where our clothes come from down the kind of production supply chain. Once they have landed in Australia, and they've been bought by us as consumers, what then happens to them when we have them and we wear them and we wash them and then we dispose of them? So again, we don't have actual data, but we suspect that about 90% of clothes worn by Australians are imported and 10% are made here locally, which is fantastic. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of discussion in the industry about increasing more local production, especially since COVID, which I think is probably we're going to see play out in the next few years. But essentially, so garments are sold through the retail channels. They're used, washed and worn by us. And then at end of life, there are essentially several different ways that we as fashion or consumers of clothing are discarding them. They're either getting thrown into our household bins, what you know, Willoughby Council would call their curbside collection. And Willoughby actually did do a study a few years ago. They used an auditing firm to identify how much clothing and textiles is in the red bins, and apparently 4.2% is in the bins. So Willoughby Council know, which is fantastic, that they've got these 5% of their red bins have, including clothing and textiles, that's all going to landfill. So we can, you know, Willoughby Council ideally are going to be looking at some solutions to try and obviously reduce the amount of clothing that goes into those red bins. The other big pathway is that people are donating their clothing to charity. And the other kind of third pathway is that they're being left on, you know, roadsides for council cleanups. So just taking the charity shop pathway, because this is kind of the most known here in Australia. We've got a really strong charity shop sector. There's only the Charitable Recycling Australia, that's the industry body that represents all the charities, has only kind of in the last 2 years starting to gather their own data, which is fantastic. So we're starting to get a sense of what's happening across all the different charity shops, Salvation Army, Vinnie's, etc. So we know in the Sydney region that 60,000 tonnes are being donated, 60,000 tonnes of apparel, that is, and clothing are being donated to charity shops. And then what is happening to them once the charity shops have them? This is where certain charity shops, well, it's been not that transparent, but I think it's starting to become a little bit more known. So they're telling us that 17% of what is donated to them is then resold through their retail shops. They're saying 36% of what they can't resell through their shops is being recycled in Australia. It's not clear exactly what they mean by recycled. I understand maybe it's being ragged or turned into shoddy, which is kind of a downcycling. 33% is being then resold. Some commercial operators are then buying the leftovers that the charity shops can't do anything with, and they're then sending it overseas to resell to, you know, African countries, etc. Or 14% of what the charity shops can't sell, can't on-sell, is going to landfill. So that's really good new data that we now have that's going to help, help us come up with some better solutions. So that's kind of the end of part one. I just wondered if anyone had any questions, comments.
Hi, I'll just quickly reiterate some of the questions in the chat.
Yes.
So Mary asked, what about a return and earn scheme for fashion and textiles? Is that a good idea? And if you know of any examples in Sydney?
Return and earn for from a brand's perspective, so a fashion brand, or
in general, but I also have some questions from various audiences asking about H&M or Uniqlo recycling bin.
Yeah. So so in the last few years, there's been this huge trend towards, so the fashion brands are starting to introduce their own what we call take back scheme. So obviously there's been huge discussion across all the kind of stakeholder groups, like whose issue is this? Who's responsible? You know, is it a government council issue? Is it the consumer's problem? Is it the industry's problem? So industry have stepped up and they are starting to introduce take-back schemes. H&M were one of the largest and most sort of early adopters to do this. Essentially, from my understanding, this was a few years ago that this was verified. I don't know if they've changed, but I know that they will be collecting those garments and essentially on-selling them. So doing what the charity shops do, which is they basically sell that on to a commercial recycling operator who then ships it globally to be worn as more clothes. I know that's like H&M also do have a lot of in-house R&D, so they are exploring new ways to recycle down to the fibre, and I'm going to get into that in the next section. But yeah, so it is starting to be done by a lot of the retailers and the brands. The trick for them is obviously they've got to incentivize us as the consumer to do this. And I think, you know, H&M you get a voucher to then shop for more clothes. You know, this is the big elephant in the room in this whole space is, you know, this idea of limits to growth, that we only have one planet with finite resources, and these fashion companies are touting themselves as closing the loop on fashion. H&M, one of the largest in the world, is trying to do that. But, you know, how much is that just perpetuating more overconsumption? So again, I don't have an answer for that, but it's a really good kind of thing to have in the back of our minds.
Thank you. There's a question from Sarah. Do we know if the government is sourcing alternative country to collect waste now that China is not?
That's a very good question. I don't actually know. So if we're assuming that China banned our, I'm not sure whether, I need to look into it, but I'm not sure whether we were actually shipping secondhand clothing to China, apparel. I know we were shipping some textile waste, but I don't think it was apparel. I think it might have been other types of textiles. So you've got a lot of commercial textiles. You've got like old, like flags, you know, like trucks have those flaps to, you know, all of that is actually textiles. And so that's considered commercial and industrial and not apparel. So I understand that China wasn't taking our apparel. They were actually just taking other types of textile. But yeah, I don't know the answer to that. That's a very good question. Have we then just diverted it to another country? I'm not sure.
Thanks. There is also some questions about the impact of woolen clothing or linen. Can you give us an overview of those type of textiles?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't really have time to go into all the different fibre groups, but yeah, absolutely. I mean, wool we know is our much loved, you know, Australian kind of classic that's, yeah, falls under the natural category. It's, well, I don't know, in terms of its sustainability profile, it's good. It gets good marks on the kind of some of the industry tools that measure different fibres and give them a scoring. You know, there's a little bit of an issue with what happens to the actual sheep when the way that they're treated, and there's a few toxic impacts. But the Australian and New Zealand wool industry is kind of considered the best in the world. Our only main issue with wool is that the stupidity of us nationally having this fantastic raw material, but then shipping it off to have another country add value to it. That's the main issue. We should be adding value to it, which means spinning and making it into a fibre here.
Thank you, Clara. I think we'll stop the discussion for now, and I'll let you continue with your presentation.
Yeah.
And then we might have some time for more questions at the end.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rowena. Okay, so that kind of sets the scene for, you know, the context, the problem, and also now we've got this fantastic new data that I just shared. That's hot off the press, actually, that new data. So you guys are getting this, you know, before many other people have got it. So it's really great to be sharing that. And that's thank you to the New South Wales EPA for funding some of that data gathering. So now I want to just cast ourselves forward to the future. So that's the problem. The way that the fashion and textile industry was set up through the 20th century is essentially very, very damaging from an environmental perspective. So what can we do about it? And this is where we introduce the concept of the circular economy. So the circular economy has become a kind of hot new framework that a lot of sectors, not just our sector. So, you know, you're seeing circular economy as a useful framework being employed by local councils at a city regional level, by a lot of other sectors. You know, the people who are manufacturing white goods, those kind of consumer goods, are also thinking about how we can essentially shift the way we used to make products. So the way we used to make products through the 20th century, industrial mass manufacturing, was to extract resources out of the earth, make these material goods like fashion garments or fridges, and then essentially use those for a period of time and then dispose of them in landfill. So that's essentially what we're calling a linear economy. What happens if we essentially turn that into a circle or a loop? So how can we essentially create material goods that we need to use as, you know, humans operating in this busy, complex world, but how can we do it so that we keep those goods in use for longer And once they get to their end of life, how can we then preserve the value of those materials and reuse those materials? That's the kind of vision for a circular economy. And it's obviously it's a paradigm shift. And so it's a challenge, but I think it's becoming a very kind of understood way of thinking. And I think we're going to see a lot of change based on this framework in the next 20 to 50 years, I would say. So for fashion, what does this mean? I mean, there's lots of different definitions. A fantastic initiative that I will share the links with you guys after comes from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, who are a group over in the UK. So their vision for what circularity means for fashion is a circular economy for fashion creates better products and services for customers. It contributes to a resilient and thriving fashion industry, and it regenerates the environment. So that's the key, is not only are we keeping these goods in circulation for longer, but how can we actually have an industrial process that's regenerating the earth rather than destroying it? So a big challenge, but there's a lot of change that's happening around this. And there's lots of different kind of ways you can close the loop in terms of fashion garments. I'm going to just touch on a few, but essentially you might have all seen this, very simple diagram, which is essentially a more sophisticated version of what we used to just call recycling. That's essentially what this is. This is the kind of 2.0 of recycling. It's saying ultimately we need to keep all of our fashion garments and textiles in use for longer, and we need to use those materials at end of life. How are we going to do that? In fashion, hugely difficult. Obviously, you have so many different categories of product. You have outerwear jackets made from synthetic. You have linen dresses. You have cotton jersey t-shirts. So we know that it's complex for our product categories, and hence why we're starting to understand that not all fashion products can be completely recycled down to a new fiber and respun. It's just not going to be possible. So we need to start thinking about these, what we call inner loops. So, as simple as how do we keep a garment in use for longer? We can repair it. How can we hand it on to someone else? Obviously, the charity sector have been doing this for years, but now industry is starting to see it as a commercial potential. How can we have rental or reuse where we on-sell? Remake, how could we remanufacture fashion products? So we basically appropriate them or adapt them, but keep them at their garment shape. And then ultimately, the ultimate kind of gold standard is recycle the fiber. How can we close the loop and respin new fiber? That's the most challenging. So I'm just going to go through those different options. So repair, very simple way is, as users of clothing, and I'll talk about this at the end, we need to kind of remember the ways that we've always in the past kept and repaired clothing. Obviously the younger generations typically we've lost those skills, but they're absolutely essential. And then lots of brands are also sort of telling us to do this and signaling to us. The next kind of outer layer, reuse and rental. There's now these new business models emerging where customers are being sold membership. So you can buy a monthly membership to a fashion brand where they send you pay them $30 a month, and they literally send you 2 to 3 garments a month, and then you can send them back once you've worn them. Or Dbop, which is a kind of fantastic on-selling platform. It's basically like Facebook Marketplace, but a bit trendier. So those secondhand markets have always existed in fashion, but they're just becoming more obvious, and the digital and the internet is being used to accelerate it. And then, as I said, the ultimate aim, or what people are saying is the ultimate, is to recycle the material, the fiber, down to the fiber level. This has been very challenging. Traditionally, the main way that we used to do this with natural fibers was mechanical recycling, which is essentially shredding and respinning. We know we can't do that with cotton very well, as I said previously. We have to blend it with a new virgin fiber. So these jeans and the Country Road have a new collection. They are respinning cotton, but they're blending it with a new cotton. So it's like a 50% recycled cotton, 50% virgin cotton, which is good. I mean, it's a great breakthrough. But then what we're seeing is, because we know mechanical recycling is very challenging, and what the fashion industry, especially high fashion, want is a beautiful new super quality yarn. The only way we're going to be able to do that is this chemical recycling. So this is essentially clothing is thrown into a vat. Chemicals are actually poured into the vat. It's done, you know, it can be done in a very closed loop way. And then they're essentially re-spinning or repolymerizing that pulp, essentially like they do with viscose, and spinning it into new fiber. Two big companies are doing this. At the moment, not at scale. We're still only seeing this at the kind of startup stage, at the lab stage, but it's definitely coming online soon. One of the really exciting startups is an Australian company on the right there, Blocktex. So they are actually building, as we speak, their first production facility outside Brisbane, where they're not working with apparel. They're going to take bedding and sheets from the hospitality sector, but they're essentially going to take a poly cotton sheet, a bedding sheet. They're going to throw it into a vat. They're going to chemically separate the polyester from the cotton. They're not going to respin both of those. They're actually going to dry those, and they're going to make pellets and powder. And then they're going to sell the pellets and the powder to other sectors, so like the building sector. So we're not going to be respinning it here in Australia, but at least these guys are pioneering. So it's really exciting. But the company on the left, RenewCell, they are in Sweden, and they're trying to respin it into new fiber. And so that's the kind of all the different inner loops that we're seeing in this circular economy framework. And then I just thought I'd throw in my favorite that really fits in the kind of what we call the biological nutrient cycle of the circular economy. This is composting a bra. So Very Good Bra is a beautiful small brand by a fantastic lady called Stephanie Devine. She partnered with an industrial composter down in Wagga Wagga. She put a bra in the compost, and 6 weeks later, all that is left is the synthetic label. So again, that's not at scale. There are a few other trials going on here in Australia exploring how we can potentially scale the composting of natural textiles. I'm involved in one myself. So that's again a very exciting but not yet in the market potential solution. I was going to talk a little bit about that, but I might just leave it at that, because there's two other companies who are doing interesting things, but they're downcycling textiles and they're making them into new products that are not textiles. But I think Sarah is going to talk a little bit about one of those. So, you know, obviously that vision that I've just laid out is hugely future oriented. It is going to be very challenging. And, you know, I've been involved in discussions around all of the different stakeholders and how we are going to actually make this happen. But just simply, you know, what's needed to make this happen? Designers and brands. So designers need to design more for their products to be able to be recycled at end of life, and brands need these take-back schemes that reward customers. Councils, local councils need to develop more efficient collection systems and find these recycling partners. Consumers, we need more information and knowledge on how we can care for our clothes, and then what are the correct channels once we're returning them, whether it's a brand take-back scheme or it's your local council collection. Charity shops, again, they need their sorters to be able to get really good at identifying these different garment types for their appropriate recycling processes. And policy, government, you know, at the moment, there's a federally funded scheme investigating this very question. Should brands pay a voluntary or mandatory tax on each fashion garment that is sold to fund a kind of national product stewardship scheme. They're doing this for rubber tires, they've done it for plastics. Could we do it for clothing? So all of this is kind of to be discussed and to be explored. So any questions or comments on that? Is I don't know if Rowena is there.
Yes, I'm here. I'm just reading lots of comments from our audiences, lots of great suggestions. I think all of us agree that we need to cut consumption overall. And Mary just made a suggestion about the Willoughby Council setting up a website or a web page on how to recycle all these fashion or textiles, things that we could do. So I think that's a great idea, and I think we could definitely add a page on our council website, very simple steps that people can follow to help. I think Emma just said we do have one, so I think we can send that link to everyone as well. I think Mary also suggested perhaps we can have a web page of a list of all these charity shops and all these businesses that are doing a lot of great work in terms of sustainable fashion. So yeah, lots of great suggestions from our audiences.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah. Does anyone else in the audiences have questions? You can just ask Clara directly while she's here.
Oh, we've got someone who's a quilter and a knitter. Yes. Oh, it's so good. Yeah, recycling centre at Willoughby would be amazing. Have you guys haven't got something like that? No?
I think we use the North Sydney.
Okay.
Yeah, there's one at Singleton.
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, Clara, do you go to do you come and talk to schools? Sue is just asking.
Yes. Yep. I've done a little bit of that. Yep. Yep. Absolutely. I did. Yeah. No, I do actually. Yeah. It's an interesting one. Is the kind of the school. Well, there's the school uniform piece, but then there's the kind of curriculum. Yeah, and educating around it.
And just maybe two more questions from the audiences. The clothes that are made from recycled bottles, can they also be recycled?
Yeah, this is tricky. There's only one company in the whole world, as far as I understand at the moment, and they're in Japan, that can make recycled polyester from old polyester textiles. So it's not it's a very you don't hear about it. The brands aren't really making that very clear, but most recycled polyester is coming from plastic bottles. So at the moment, once they've been made, once you buy a garment and it says recycled polyester on it, that's great because we know the inputs have been recycled. But for you then, once you've finished with that, no, there's nowhere really for it to go. So that again is the other kind of big question is what's the use if the inputs are great, the inputs are recycled, but at its end of life, it's still going to end up in landfill. So when I train design teams in industry around this, we call that that's called an open, that's kind of like an open loop. We haven't closed the loop. We've kind of, the inputs are recycled, but it's still going into landfill. Eventually it will come, but it's going to take a long time for the technology to be able to recycle polyester garments.
I was just going to jump on if you can hear me, and I think it's really fascinating about how that textiles can be recycled. But yeah, it does seem still so difficult, and all those chemicals sound pretty horrible.
Yes.
I know personally I'm trying to, do all the right things, but sometimes you buy new things. And one of the things I have to buy is leggings for my girls, and I buy leggings new. And they get a hole in the knee and in the bum really quickly. And so what I do is I actually chop them up and I tie them together, and I make my dog a chew kind of rope. And it gets turned into tiny rags quite quickly and goes in the bin. And also cut off the elastic top, and then I can use that elastic top to make the kids' skirts or whatever. So, I'm really trying to get that thing that I buy quite regularly into, and it's probably not made that ethically, but into nothing. Yeah.
Brilliant. There you go. I love it. Upcycling in action.
And Clara, we've got about 10 more minutes.
Yes. Okay, good. Thanks, Emma. Well, I'll just finish up then with the final section, which is really, we've touched on most of it. It's really just kind of, well, what can we do now, as we're kind of already discussing? So, hang on. Just close all that down. Okay. So, excuse me. That's me. So, what can we do now? Now, there's there's kind of three things I like to say to people. Firstly, become a more conscious consumer. And this, the data tells us that this is more challenging for certain genders, as in women and girls, and more challenging depending on your age. I mean, that's not to say, that's kind of a generalization, but kind of not. We know that the majority of fast fashion consumers do tend to be aged between 18 to 35. And I know for myself, anecdotally, the older I've gotten, the less I'm much more conscious about how I shop. But again, that's not to say that it's all based on age. But, essentially I would say, think before you buy any new clothes. That's the first thing. Shop your values. What is important to you? If you're a vegetarian and you're, really mindful about animal products, make your choice based on that. Or you might be an ocean lover and you don't want to contribute to ocean plastics, which we know come from the washing of polyester. I haven't really gone into that much, but so I guess the point is shop your values, do your research. There's a really, use these ethical consumer guides like Good On You is a fantastic Australian-based one. So yeah, just more conscious consuming. I would say in terms of once you own your clothes and you're wearing them and you're caring for them, as I've said, repairing, low impact washing. We also know that there's a lot of environmental impacts in the washing stage of clothing, especially heavily laundered things like cotton t-shirts. So reducing your temperatures. I mean, here in Australia, it's not hard for us to wash at low temperatures. I know when I was in the UK 10 years ago, there was a huge campaign from Marks and Spencer's and a few other initiatives to try and get people they did this study. If they all reduced the temperature on their washing machine from 40 down to 30, it had these huge savings in terms of emissions. And obviously try and avoid using the dryer and dry cleaning. We've got such a great climate here in Australia to do line drying. And if you are interested in the kind of microplastics issue, you can buy these special wash bags called the Guppy Friend, which you would put your synthetics in, and it is a filter for microplastics. So, those are kind of simple things to do in the kind of use phase when you're washing and wearing and caring for your clothes. And then obviously end of life, as I said, once we've finished with our clothing, I mean, again, the other kind of thing that is not talked about, you know, as I said, the waste management sector are very getting onto this now. They're all understanding that textiles is this emerging problematic waste stream. But what's not often discussed or understood is the kind of complexity of, you know, the emotional kind of behavior around clothing. So why do we get rid of certain things and not others? There is a study that an initiative in the UK called WRAP, W-R-A-P, have done, and they've actually surveyed people to understand what are the reasons that they decide to get rid of clothes. And they're fascinating. You know, like one of the big reasons is people change their body weight. So they essentially put on weight, or I think mainly putting on weight and less losing weight. And that's one of the main reasons people discard garments. You know, clothing is so tied in with our self-identity. It's tied in with our emotional life. So all of that nuance and behaviors need to also be understood when we're talking about clothing and end of life. But, you know, I guess from our point of view as kind of general consumers, at end of life, when we want to dispose of things, you know, try and get a better understanding to see what charity shops need for quality donations, because they're obviously seeing a huge uptake of people just donating all of this crap that they're then having to do something with. Sell your old clothes through these resale platforms, obviously pass them on to family and friends, which a lot of us already do. And even just start having chats to your local council and to your local charity shop. As I was saying to Emma, you know, this topic is really emerging now, and there's going to be, a lot more discussion, and there's a lot more transparency. So I think as a kind of community, we all need to start having these conversations more, and upskilling and doing our own research. So thank you. Thanks for listening. I don't know if anyone's got any questions.
That was great, Clara. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Sarah. Oh, I'll stop sharing, shall I? Hang on.
All right. So just quickly in summary, and of course, if you do have any more questions for Clara, please pop them into the chat. I'm Sarah. I work on the Better Business Partnership Program at Willoughby Council. So we work with businesses in the Willoughby Council area to help them reduce their waste to landfill and to minimise their consumption as well. I've been with Willoughby Council for a year, but prior to that I was living in Southeast Asia, in Cambodia in particular. So I have seen the other side to what Clara was talking about, and it is such an important topic. So this is a really important thing for me too. I'm wearing my thrifted flowers from a local lifeline, and buying secondhand is really important, and living the values as well. When Clara was touching on some of the recycling programs and what to do with clothing that's really reached the end of its life, it can't be repaired and it can't sort of really do anything more with its life. We do have one of our business members at Better Business Partnership called Worn Up, and they work with a lot of the schools to take those textiles that cannot be fixed or reused and to turn them into more useful items. They're still testing a lot in the market. They're quite new, but they have been on several news shows. So I'm sure if you Google Worn Up, we might be able to find one of those news stories to include in the follow-up email as well. We're starting a 6-month trial at Willoughby Council partnering with Worn Up. We've got 5 to 6 schools on board already, and we'll be seeing how that goes and can we make an impact in terms of reducing that end of life textiles waste and stopping it from going into landfill. It came up in the chat, but I do want to mention there is an upcoming event that the council are putting on called Canter Stitching. It looks absolutely beautiful. It's like patchworking with those small bits of fabric that you can make a brand new tote bag or something similar, to stop some of those things. Sometimes we might have a pillowcase or a top that we absolutely love, but we can't wear it anymore, you know, maybe we can turn it into something beautiful that we can continue to love and use in our lives. And also, I would like to say on the Better Business Partnership front, we do have an upcoming campaign called Buy Better, Buy Local. So this is about understanding what you're purchasing at the beginning. And many of the businesses in the Better Business Partnership program, you know, are really living those values of minimizing their environmental impacts, but also making sure that they are doing well for community and social aspects of business as well. So please keep an eye out for the Buy Better, Buy Local campaign, which will help you as consumers to be able to make more conscious purchasing decisions. So I think that's everything for today. We're, you know, really happy to have had you, Clara. Thank you for so much valuable insight. I haven't seen any other questions come through, but we will have a follow-up email and, you know, and ways for everyone to get in touch if there's anything else later on.
Brilliant.
All righty.
I have a question in the chat. There's a question in the chat.
Okay. I can't see who's saying that.
I'll just repeat the question. I think a question from AA. How can a stylist or personal shopper or boutique owner practice sustainability when your job is to source pieces for clients and style and sell? Any advice or tips?
I mean, it would be just doing your own desk research using the internet, obviously, to understand different brands and which ones you think are practicing a little bit more sustainably than others. It can be quite tricky. You do have to do a little bit of research. So a lot of them now are having sustainability reports. So you might have to read some of their reports. Again, use the Good on You consumer review, you know, ethical consumer review. I think they've got an app, or you can use their website. I mean, obviously you can try and source secondhand, resale stuff, but yeah, it's a mixture of having to do your own research to understand which brands you feel fit. I mean, a really nice thing to do if you're a personal shopper, you could do it. I don't know whether you would already do it, is you could survey your client and get a little sense of your client's personal values. That's a really nice thing to do. You know, it's almost like I do a bit of coaching. And so when I start to work with someone, you got to get a sense of who they are and what's their values system. Mm-hmm. And then once you get clear on that, then you can start. That's a really nice way to do it, is a kind of discovering them and their values. And then you can start choosing brands that you feel align to them and what their values and lifestyle is.
I'd also add that you could start weaving into some of that into your marketing. So if that's your small business, demonstrating some of those things that are beautiful or secondhand or upcycled or boutique, yes, natural fibers, and starting to position that so perhaps new clients that come on board will be drawn to you because you are practicing sustainability in your business as a personal shopper.
Yes, absolutely. And even just talking a bit to, even the natural fiber piece or whatever it is going to pique their interest. Yeah. Beautiful. Great question. Wonderful. Well, it's 4 minutes past. Thank you everyone for hanging on for those extra few minutes over. This has been wonderful. Thank you all for being here, and thank you again, Clara and Emma, for your amazing initiative in kicking this off. And thanks, Rowena, for your support as well. So have a beautiful afternoon.